The morning room in Clarence House was flooded with pale winter light, but the atmosphere around the mahogany writing table was tense. A senior member of the Royal Protection Command stood ramrod straight, his polished shoes firmly planted on the antique rug, facing the Queen Consort. The aide who had delivered the message had already retreated, closing the heavy door with a soft click that seemed to echo. The officer had been summoned personally, which was unusual. Usually, these matters were handled by private secretaries or palace liaisons. But this was different. This was about a car. The vehicle in question was a 2006 Range Rover, finished in a deep Tonga green, a color that had become synonymous with the late Queen. It wasn't just any car from the extensive royal fleet. It was the car. And the one Elizabeth II had preferred for personal use, often spotted behind the wheel herself, a headscarf tied under her chin, motoring around the estates at Sandringham or Balmoral with a faithful corgi in the back. It had been delivered by Land Rover's Special Vehicle Operations, fitted with discreet modifications, reinforced running boards, enhanced internal wiring for secure communications, and a bespoke dog guard. The bonnet ornament, a silver Labrador retrieving a grouse, was a personal touch from the late monarch herself. For years, it had been a familiar sight, a symbol of the Queen's private, unguarded moments away from the gilded state carriages and limousines. Now, Camilla wanted it for her son, Tom Parker Bowles. The logic, from her perspective, was simple. The vehicle was part of the late Queen's personal effect. Now it was sitting in a garage gathering dust. Why let it languish when it could be used and appreciated by a family member? It was a generous, motherly thought. Tom was a respected food writer and critic, a man about town who attended countless events, restaurant openings, and literary festivals. The Range Rover, with its powerful supercharged V8 engine, would be a practical and, in her eyes, fitting vehicle for him. It was robust, capable, and carried the understated elegance of the monarchy without the overt pomp of a state car. It would be a wonderful gift, a tangible connection to his step-grandmother, a woman he had known and respected for years. The protection officer listened, his face an impassive mask, trained over decades of service. When Camilla finished outlining her request, there was a pause. He then spoke, his voice low and measured, explaining the intricate protocols that governed the dispersal of the late Queen's assets. He mentioned that the vehicle was not merely a piece of transportation, it was a piece of documented royal history, an asset of the sovereign grant, and its fate was subject to a chain of command that had existed for centuries. The conversation, initially amicable, began to shift. Camilla, accustomed to having her domestic requests handled with efficiency, found herself meeting a wall of procedure. The officer was not being difficult, he was being correct. He suggested the matter be raised through the proper channels with the Lord Chamberlain's office, which oversees royal logistics. The officer's measured procedural response inadvertently struck a nerve. The suggestion that she, the Queen Consort, and needed to fill out forms and wait in a bureaucratic line for a car that had been sitting idle felt in that moment like a slight. The memory of past indignities, the long years of being cast as the other woman, the careful navigation of palace hierarchies, all of it simmered beneath the surface. Her voice, usually warm and tinged with a smoker's rasp, took on a sharper edge. She reiterated that it was a simple request for a family car, not a crown jewel. The officer remained firm, reiterating the protocols, with a politeness that somehow made it worse. What happened next was the spark that would ignite the story. The officer, trained to anticipate threats and manage volatile situations, recognized the shift in the room. But this was not a public street with a mob. This was a private residence. as he began to reiterate once more, and the necessity of following the established procedure, Camilla's composure finally cracked. "For God's sake!" she snapped, her voice rising above its usual husky timbre. "It's just a bloody car!" The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. She wasn't shouting at the faceless institution of the monarchy. She was shouting at the man in front of her, the embodiment of the inflexible system that seemed, even now, to place obstacles in her path. The officer's face remained a study in neutrality, but the slight tightening of his jaw was the only tell. He had not been shouted at by a member of the royal family in a very long time. He gave a short, precise nod, confirmed he would note her request through the appropriate channels, and withdrew from the room, the door closing with another soft, definitive click. The incident, however, was already a story, a tremor that would soon be felt in the tightly knit world of royal households, and eventually, the press. The echo of the sharp words in the Clarence House morning room had barely faded before the machinery of the palace began to turn. The protection officer, a man whose entire career was built on discretion and adherence to protocol, did exactly what his training dictated. He reported the conversation. He did not do so out of malice or a sense of personal affront. He did so because the interaction had crossed a line. The request and the manner of its delivery touched upon the management of the late Queen's estate, a matter of official record. Within hours, a memo, discreet and factual, was making its way through the secure communication lines that connected the Royal Protection Command to the Lord Chamberlain's office. The news landed in different quarters with different weights. To the senior officials in the Lord Chamberlain's office, it was a procedural headache. The late Queen's will is sealed by tradition and law, but the dispersal of her personal property, from her prized thoroughbreds to her private fleet of vehicles, followed a rigorous, if unwritten, code. The Tonga Green Range Rover was not just a car, it was an inventory item with significant historical and monetary value. It had been modified specifically for her. Its provenance was impeccable. To simply gift it to a step-grandson, however well-regarded, would set a precedent. What about the late Queen's other vehicles? What about the horses? What about the paintings? The palace operates on precedent. A single deviation creates a ripple effect that can destabilize decades of established practice. Meanwhile, in the private quarters of Highgrove and Birkhall, the story took on a different tone. King Charles III, a man known for his attention to detail and his occasional flashes of impatience, was undoubtedly made aware of the incident. He has a long and complex history with Camilla, a relationship forged in adversity and sealed in marriage. He is fiercely protective of her, yet he is also the ultimate custodian of his mother's legacy. The image of his wife clashing with a palace guard over his mother's car would have been deeply uncomfortable. It was reminiscent of the public spats of the past, and the infamous pen incidents where his frustration bubbled over in front of the cameras. But this was private, and in some ways, worse. It was a clash between his present and his past. He likely counseled patience, urging Camilla to let the matter rest, to allow the system he was now the head of to run its course. He knew the palace machinery better than anyone. Pushing against it only led to friction and leaks. And the leaks were coming. The story of the royal guard shouted at Camilla was too juicy to remain contained. It began as whispers in the staff canteens, a tale passed between footmen and clerical staff. "Did you hear about the Queen Consort and the Range Rover?" From there, it migrated to the private clubs of St. James's, where retired military men and former courtiers clucked their tongues over glasses of claret. And some saw it as proof of Camilla's pushiness, her desire to secure her family's future at the expense of royal tradition. Others saw it as a normal request from a stepmother to a stepson, complicated by the bizarre bubble of royal life. The protection officer, now an unwilling celebrity in this internal drama, became a symbol of integrity to some and of bureaucratic obstruction to others. As the days passed, the tension did not dissipate. It metastasized. The car remained in its garage. Tom Parker Bowles, likely unaware of the full extent of the storm his mother was weathering on his behalf, continued his life, reviewing restaurants and attending literary parties. But for Camilla, every public appearance, every wave to the crowd, was now shadowed by the private humiliation. She had been shouted down not by a person, but by a system, and the palace, which had once been her greatest adversary, was now her cage. The story was out there, a ghost in the machine, waiting for its moment to materialize in the pages of a newspaper or a tabloid website. The battle lines were drawn, the emotional desires of the new queen consort versus the cold, immutable logic of royal tradition. And in this war, there would be no clear winner, only fallout. The story broke not with a bang, but with a carefully placed whisper. It didn't appear on the front page of the major broadsheets immediately. Instead, it surfaced in the diary of a society magazine, a paragraph of carefully couched innuendo about tensions between the new queen consort and palace staff regarding the dispersal of the late queen's personal effects. The anonymity of the source was thinly veiled. It was clearly someone inside the palace walls, someone who had heard the story and decided, for reasons of their own, to let the public in on the secret. From there, it was a feeding frenzy. The tabloids, ever eager for a story that pitted the new royals against the memory of the beloved late queen, pounced. The headlines were predictably lurid. "Camilla's Range Rover rage," screamed one. "Queen consort in car clash with guard," shouted another. The story, as it was told to the public, was a simplified, dramatized version of events. The nuance of palace protocol, the justified concerns of the protection officer, the complex history of royal asset management, all of that was stripped away. What remained was a simple, compelling narrative. A demanding stepmother, trying to grab a piece of the late queen's legacy for her own son. Was publicly, in the telling, it was always more public than it was, shouted down by a loyal guard who dared to defend the memory of his former sovereign. It was a perfect storm of resentment, envy, and tradition. The public reaction was split, as it always is with Camilla. For her longtime detractors, the ones who had never forgiven her for her role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, it was proof positive of her greed and ambition. "She's been after the crown for decades, and now she's after the cars," read a typical comment on a royal news site. "The queen must be turning in her grave." The image of the stoic royal guard, defending the late queen's possessions, became a meme, a symbol of quiet resistance against the new order. For others, the reaction was more sympathetic, and they saw a mother trying to do something nice for her son, a son who, by marriage, was part of the family. They pointed out that Tom Parker Bowles had never put a foot wrong, had never traded on his connection to the royals, and was a successful figure in his own right. Why shouldn't he have the car? The palace, in this narrative, was the villain, a soulless bureaucracy intent on hoarding treasures rather than allowing them to be used and loved. The king found himself in an impossible position. Publicly, he had to support his wife. Privately, he was reportedly furious that a private family matter had been turned into a public circus. The incident threatened to undo years of careful work to rehabilitate Camilla's image, work that had culminated in the king's own public statement on her 70th birthday, he calling her his darling wife and expressing his deep gratitude for her support. Now, that carefully crafted image was being scratched by the very institution he was sworn to protect. He instructed his communications team to let the story die, to issue no formal comment, to refuse to feed the beast. But the beast was already well fed. For weeks the story lingered, a low-grade fever in the royal body politic. Columnists opined on the curse of the stepmother. Royal historians drew comparisons to the Duchess of Windsor. And the world was treated to endless speculation about the fate of a single green car. In the end, the resolution was as anticlimactic as the initial confrontation was dramatic. The Range Rover did not go to Tom Parker Bowles. The palace bureaucracy, immovable as a granite cliff, held firm. The vehicle, and with its dog guard and its silver Labrador ornament and its 120,000 miles of royal history, was deemed too significant to simply give away. It was an asset. It had to be accounted for. The decision, when it came, was delivered with typical royal vagueness. It was decided that the vehicle would be placed in a long-term storage facility, part of the extensive royal collection of historic vehicles, kept for posterity, a museum piece before its time. It would sit in the dark, gathering dust, its engine never to turn over again, a silent monument to a battle it never asked to be a part of. It was a decision that satisfied no one and irritated everyone. To Camilla's supporters, it was a petty act of bureaucratic spite. To her detractors, it was justice served. Years passed. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, newer dramas. The king continued his reign, Camilla continued her duties, and Tom Parker Bowles continued to write about food, presumably using a car that was not his stepmother's. But the legend of the Range Rover grew. It became a piece of royal lore, whispered to new staff as a cautionary tale. Be careful what you ask for, and be even more careful how you ask for it. The protection officer who had stood his ground was quietly promoted, his discretion and adherence to protocol noted in his personnel file. He had done his job, and he had been rewarded for it. Then, in the summer of 2025, the Range Rover re-emerged into the light. Iconic auctioneers announced that the late Queen Elizabeth II's personal 2006 Range Rover would be going under the hammer at the Silverstone Festival. The world gasped. The car, at once the subject of such intense private drama, was now a public commodity. The auction house described its provenance in glowing terms. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's personal Range Rover combines automotive excellence with an unmatched historical significance. It was finished in Tonga green, it had the dog guard, it had the silver Labrador mascot. The grab handles, once fitted to aid the Queen's ingress and egress, had been removed, but the legend remained. The pre-sale estimate was between £50,000 and £70,000. On the day of the auction, the tension was palpable. Bidders from around the world, collectors and royal enthusiasts, competed via phone and internet. The price soared past the estimates, climbing with each bid. When the hammer finally fell, the car had sold for a staggering £175,000, more than double the highest estimate, and 20 times the value of a standard 2006 model. The buyer was reported to be from the Caribbean. The car, which had caused so much strife within the palace walls, was now bound for a new life on a tropical island, far from the gray skies of London. The final ironic twist was that Camilla's request, had it been granted, would have been the more modest outcome. The car would have remained in the family, driven, used, and loved. Instead, the palace's intransigence had preserved it perfectly for the market, turning a piece of family history into a record-breaking sale for a foreign collector. The system had won, as it always does, but it had also created a new chapter in the story. A final, bittersweet punchline to a tale that began with a shout in a quiet morning room. The Queen's car, the symbol of the clash, was gone. But the legend of the day, the royal guard shouted at Camilla, would live on forever.